Well, that's an uplifting gospel for the year for mercy, and perhaps one that gets our attention. Jesus comes off very strongly, and he used some rather interesting metaphors in describing the point that he's making. The first, of course, is one of a building project, and it reminds me of the television show from the 90s, Home Improvement. Some of you may still remember that show. It was centered around the TV show Tool Time, in which Tim the Toolman Taylor talked about building houses, repairing the physical part of the house. But his TV show always ran parallel to what was going on in his own home between he and his wife and his children. So home improvement, on the one hand, of the physical house, but also, on the other hand, the home improvement of the relationship of the family. See the metaphor involved there. If I were an expert on home improvement, I might dwell on that as part of this homily. But liking history as I do, I'm intrigued by the other metaphor that Jesus uses, which is one of war and combat. And those of you who know of history or literature, there's an ancient Chinese work that has had tremendous impact on many facets of civilization, not just war, and it is called the Sun Tzu, otherwise known in English as the Art of War. Yes, folks, your Catholic priest is going to use an instruction on how to make war as part of his homily today. But the reason why it is such an influential classic is because it also is used by businessmen, politicians, diplomats, as giving solutions and instructions on conflict and conflict resolution. And the instructions on war are also seen as very much a metaphor for human relations. And let me just read a portion of it, obviously not the whole thing. And you might hear something similar to what Jesus is saying in today's gospel. The method of employing the military, with 1,000 fast chariots, 1,000 leather-covered chariots, 1,000 armored troops to be provisioned over 1,000 li. Then expenses of outer and inner stipends of foreign advisors, materials for glue and lacquer, and contributions for chariots and armor are 1,000 gold pieces a day. Only after this are 100,000 soldiers raised. When one employs battle, if victory takes long, it blunts the military and grinds down its sharpness. Attacking walled cities, one's strength is diminished. If soldiers are long in the field, the state's resources are insufficient. Now, if one blunts the military, grinds down its sharpness, diminishes its strength, and exhausts its goods, then the feudal lords ride one's distress and rise up. Even one who is wise cannot make good the aftermath. Thus in the military one has heard of foolish speed, but has not observed skillful prolonging. And there has never been a military prolonging that has brought advantage to the state. And so one who does not thoroughly know the harm from employing the military cannot thoroughly know the advantage from employing the military. Similar words to what Jesus is saying today is know your resources, know what you have to work with before committing a military campaign or a building project. And the basic message in today's gospel, as shocking as it might be, is know what you're getting yourself into when you declare your discipleship for Christ. Know what that cost is and make sure you have the stamina, the character, and the will to do it before you declare yourself a follower of Christ and then find out it's too much for you. And what are some of the examples Jesus gives us? Unless you hate your father and your mother, your brother and your sister, your children and yourself. Now, show of hands, how many in here hate your mother and father? No, keep them up so I can count. It would seem an outlandishly unrealistic thing to expect of people in this day and age. But at the time of Christ, and at the time Luke wrote his gospel and included this teaching, it was not all that unrealistic. Because where were they writing to? Who were they speaking to? A society in the midst of pagan Rome, the Roman Empire, in which families had their own deities that they worshipped and prayed to, in addition to the pantheon of gods, not the least of which was the emperor himself. I was on vacation over the last couple of weeks, and one of my stops on a road trip between Grand Rapids and Portland was I stopped in Bozeman for a couple of days in Montana and went to the Museum of the Rockies, which is famous for its dinosaur exhibit. But it also had there a temporary exhibit on Pompeii, the city that was leveled and buried by Mount Vesuvius. But it wasn't the disaster exhibit. There was some of it, but part of it was an exhibit of a basic villa that is found in Pompeii, an example of the kind of homes we see in ancient Rome. And as you walk in, there is, as you walk in the entrance, a shrine, a small but important shrine to the family deities, maybe 2 or 3. When a boy comes of age, he takes a medal off that signifies his childhood and drapes it over the god as he puts on something else to symbolize his manhood. Same thing with a young girl. They would pray to them. They would leave food for these gods. It was an important part of the culture of ancient Rome. You had family deities. But if you converted to Christianity, in which you forsake your family deities, there was a very real possibility that you would be disowned by the family, disinherited by your parents for forsaking the family gods. There was a real possibility of losing your social standing, being ostracized by your friends, even being arrested and imprisoned, and perhaps even executed. Even in the book of Revelation, at the risk of getting a little morose here, there's the sequence in which they talk about the number of the beast, 666. And I'm certainly not talking about the tattoo that Damien Thorne had on his head in the Omen trilogy. But it was a designation, most likely the number of the emperor, who had to be worshipped as a god, and you had to be publicly notarized as a worshiper of the emperor. It could have been a mark, a tattoo, or a certification that you publicly worship the emperor, which Christians would not do. And the book of Revelation says, unless the person was so marked, or perhaps so certified, it was not permitted for anyone to buy or sell from that person unless they were so marked. So even your business would be affected. Even your business would be affected if you turned to Christ and became a Christian. And so the idea of hating, turning away from father or mother, son or daughter, even your own life, would be secondary to being a follower of Christ. Did they have the stamina in the early church to know what they were getting into so that they didn't start something that they could not fulfill? Another example in the early decades of the church we see in the second reading today in the letter of Paul to Philemon, a delightful and very short letter, not even divided into chapters. But the background of that is Philemon, who was a Christian and a friend of St. Paul, had a slave named Onesimus who had run away and run to Paul. And that slave had converted to Christianity. And Paul was sending him back to his master, Philemon. And in the letter he is saying, as we hear in today's reading, I am sending you my son in Christ, a man he brought to Christ. Don't receive him as your slave, but receive him as a brother. In other words, there was almost like a social agreement among Christians. You did not enslave other Christians. Once someone was converted, you could not enslave them if you yourself were Christian. So Philemon, a Christian, now was challenged by Paul to a completely different outlook and engage in a practice that would have been revolutionary in a society in which slavery was an economic mainstay and a staple in the nobility. It's not spelled out in the letter, but tradition has it that Philemon did free Onesimus, sent him back to Paul to serve him, and that it was Onesimus, according to tradition, who collected Paul's writings into the collection of epistles that we have today. Is that the case? I don't know, but that's at least the tradition. But even there, we saw a value that eventually led to the complete abolition of slavery in post-Roman medieval Europe, which was predominantly Christian, and therefore slavery was not acceptable in terms of Christians enslaving other Christians. Rather, they paid people for work. It elevated the value of work, even to the point of kings like Charlemagne being completely against slavery. And that basic value, which cost something in Philemon, transformed Europe. Of course, a modern example of this would be a saint we see canonized today, Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta, canonized by Pope Francis just this morning. How many here are happy to hear that? How many here would be willing to give up your life now and go include yourself in the work that she does with her order? How many here would be happy if your daughter came home and said, I'd like to join her order and do her work with the poorest of the poor? And how many of those who are clapping only have sons? But how many here are also aware that for over 40 years of her life, she struggled very deeply with her faith? And who could blame her with the squalor that she worked with? I'd be surprised if she didn't. But she knew the cost and the toil, the energy, the despair, the sadness of working with the poorest of the poor. And no doubt she had to take stock of her own life before engaging in that, lest she begin something that she couldn't finish. And we all know the result of that. And she is the great modern saint that she is today. Even today, people tend to look at religion in general, but Christianity, Catholicism in particular, as predominantly something of warm fuzzies, uplifting feelings, and bubbly sentiments. We want to feel uplifted and comforted. And don't get me wrong, our faith is something of unspeakable comfort. But every now and again, it does speak to us in very personal ways that call on us to ongoing conversion, forsaking modern secular values, especially in morality, perhaps even a complete change in lifestyle. And how many among us proclaim to be followers of Christ and yet do not allow it to transform their lives as Jesus asks it to, as Jesus demands of it? How many here have known someone who said, I used to be Catholic, but I'm not Catholic anymore? Depending on who I'm talking to, I'm at least tempted to ask, what sin did you refuse to give up? I once knew someone who was looking into the RCIA, the possibility of becoming Catholic, and in the end she did not choose to be Catholic and enter the RCIA. And as she put it, she said, I want to find a church that accepts me for who I am. Well, if you know anything about Christianity, you know she would be very hard-pressed to find a church like that, because what is at the heart of our faith? Conversion. And Jesus is saying, know what you are doing when you profess discipleship. Because, folks, being a follower of Christ is not for the faint of heart. Ours is not a faith for wimps, and certainly people who are emotionally fragile, which in this day and age could speak very strongly to a phenomenon we see in our society today that is known euphemistically as political correctness. Not that we're politically incorrect. We don't want to be deliberately offensive. But why do we have such an obsession with political correctness today? It's because pretty much, for the most part, everyone is offended by, for the most part, everything, for the most part, all the time. We don't know what's going to offend someone next. We're walking on eggshells, and sometimes we ourselves get caught up in that sentiment. Are we that thin-skinned? Are we that shallow? Are we that easily offended? And us as a people of faith in a Catholic Church that has a history spanning 2,000 years in which we built Western civilization, and much of that history is persecution against us for that faith, you'd think we'd have thicker skin. And in many ways, being a follower of Christ means we must rise above the emotional frailty that we see today. That time doesn't stop simply because we get offended by something. And we even see it perhaps in a parish. At the rate some people I often find getting offended in a parish setting, gosh, one wonders how they handle the rest of the world. Whether it's be from something a priest might say, or a fellow parishioner, or a family member. It's like someone comes up and says, Father, I was offended. I want to say, no, not that, anything but that. But folks, as a people of God, as a people of faith, we've dealt with far worse. We are made of sterner stuff if we are to be the followers of Christ. We must not have skin of eggshells, but of coconut shells. A toughness in which we can rise above the overly sensitivity of the people of the society today. Again, not that we're politically incorrect. We're not afraid of offending if it helps move people to conversion, and much of what we teach is very offensive to a great many people in today's society. In many ways, ours is not a politically correct faith. But we can handle it. Christ knows we can handle it. He gives us the grace so that we can handle it, so that we can rise above it. But He tells us in today's gospel, know what you are getting yourself into, lest you start something you cannot finish, the least of which, of course, is being His follower. And so in this era in which we have grand examples from the early decades of the church of the modern world, from saints with friends like Philemon and Onesimus, to saints with friends like John Paul II and St. Teresa of Calcutta, examples of people who had that stamina, that strength of character, that endurance to declare themselves followers of Christ and follow through that with a strength that is at the admiration of the world. We look at ourselves today and see just how wimpy sometimes we can be, but we remind ourselves ours is not a faith for the faint of heart. Ours is not a faith of wimps. We can handle being offended every now and again, and we can rise above that. And why shouldn't we think that? We are Catholic Christian followers of Christ.